After rereading the story up to about chapter 900 and refreshing my mind about what actually happened, I came to the question, and I wanted to know the answer, of whether or not Su Ping could actually stop the strike on the blue planet, and whether or not he had the tools and the resources to actually do it. Was wondering whether or not there was enough time, and was wondering whether or not there was a big enough pool of resources to actually use to achieve this. Su Ping has the ability to grant pets not only new abilities, but evolution, which grants pets the ability to change themselves and to change the abilities that they do have, increasing them to some degree. Although it would be for the right price, but this ultimately is nullified by the fact that everything would simply increase in power significantly, and there would be enough people in the market to actually accept. Originally, I thought this would only go down to the families and the family heads, as they are the ones with the most amount of money and the most amount of power. But it does seem like Su Ping marketing, at least, should have gone that way, and not just randomly. A good way to look at this is to think, instead of random students and people going to the store to get this training, it would have been the 5 families. So that Long John would have actually had a significantly coordinated and more powerful strike repellent. We do see that attack helicopters and armored vehicles are roughly around the 4 to 6 area. There was also a time that Su Ping hopped into one of these SUVs and armored vehicles, and he went to a spatial crack. There he got his money, and enough money to rival a family, despite being one person. This is significant, as he also got Ruin, which was a family head of several, that is influential of several cities, making them incredibly powerful, at least when it comes to the region that they can actually affect. And we do see that they have enough power to not only destroy other cities, but it wouldn't actually be their main force. And we do see that Su Ping, in some way, does at least have that amount of power when training somebody else. Mainly Ruin. Tang, of course, did have the whole family dynamic to go through, but Su Ping always had the chance to do it with other people, not just Ruin. And we know that a 10 is the combat strength of a Beast King. So, after the Light City, he now has the ability to constantly force evolution, and he has his store to hone that. Although it wouldn't be laws, it would still have those effects, and it would greatly enhance the 5 families if they used it with their snooping, let's call it, especially on since they were able to not only know the nurse that helped Sue at the hospital before, there was also the fact that they completely overlooked the tournament at the school. This is significant because if the force of the 5 families all had 10 in combat strength, then it would require a Beast King to show up, just like the bird and the mammoth in the beginning, but it would literally be everybody at that strength. So, the only things that we would know after that point would be the tiger and the fairy, and obviously the otherworldly king. There is a bit of a question of what exactly they could do, but the more important thing is that they had 5 families with thousands of people, with even them having thousands of beasts at these Beast King levels. Had this been the choice that everybody would have made, I do not believe anything less than a Beast King would have actually done all that much. But there is more. If you took 3 people from each family, the most powerful people, and gave those people, as well as their pets, the ability to do professional training, there would have been a significant gap in power between the families and the people that came there afterwards, from the other cities, from the other continents. There would have been an even bigger gap between the families and those people. Not only that, but I do question who exactly the family would not use or would use to communicate with other cities, and how much of a stress this would relieve Su Ping of. There are a significant amount of times Su Ping didn't have to leave, and he did leave. For example, the spatial crack. He didn't need to leave. And during the tournament, he could have continuously and constantly trained his sister in the store until she, essentially, would have been at the level of a Beast King. At that point, she wouldn't have needed Snowball or the Moonfrost Dragon. She wouldn't have needed it. She would have just went up to anybody and just slapped them away. Ultimately, this would have been completely unfair, as you would essentially have somebody at the level of fighting a Beast King or even killing a Beast King, but they were not. This would essentially be somebody that could go a little bit farther than Su Ping could have, but they wouldn't have been as strong. Not that they needed that strength, but you get what I'm saying. As Su Ping was in the intermediate level of the sixth form, and she was at the high end. But in that case, you could have also saved an extra 400 chapters of him running around the continents, and she technically didn't need to actually go to the academy because the academy couldn't train her as well as he could. Although this is a world building element, obviously, but it's still something that I think should have been mentioned, at the very least. There is something unique of Venerable the Blade and his meeting, and I don't think it would have changed too much with the Star Organization getting involved. I do think that if Venerable the Blade and Su Ping had the interest in pushing him, especially with professional training, it would have gone a lot farther. The families as well would have been bloated, especially after Su Ping trained them, if the mid tiers had intermediate training. So every day there would have been 40 extra people or 40 beasts, or a mixture of both from different families. They could have broken that up as a routine. Ultimately, the money would have likely have been much greater. And there was the possibility, although unlikely, of them actually buying pet food. Although this was more of a question of whether or not anybody actually wanted it, as the price seemed just too high. And the only times that we do see this, the results were amazing, as everybody simply just got stronger, got faster, went up in strength, went up in combat strength to some degree, and it was significant enough to be a factor. At these levels, at the 9th rank, I do question if a normal person did run around and spend as much money as they could at the store, like the family heads specifically, they would be able to essentially run through Venerable the Blade thousands of times over. Then again, these families didn't really like Su Ping, and it took a long time for them to actually get used to him. But what if they didn't? What if they looked through all this and they realized that Su Ping, in some way, has the ability to push them past where they are now? Their comprehension, their abilities, their combat strength would have been greater than what they would have had in the Long John strike, and it would have been greater during the Beast strike on the Blue Planet. These factors should, at the very least, be noticed, be notified, be acknowledged, as they are significant. They are something that the texts don't go into. But again, that wasn't really the point of the story in the first place. If everyone within Long John simply just started becoming incredibly powerful, and nothing less than dozens of legendary Battle Power warriors suddenly started appearing everywhere as 9th rank pretenders, then we wouldn't have much of a beast strike in the first place. In fact, the beasts, the ocean state beasts, and the void state beasts that Su Ping pulled from the prisons might not have even been a factor in the first place, as you would have had thousands of people from all 5 families be just strong enough to be at the void level, but they're at the 9th tier. This would have been so significant that I don't think Long John, let alone the Beast Strike on the Blue Planet as a whole, would have ultimately been that big of an issue. But it's really hard to sit here and simply just state it without hindsight. Ultimately, I do not believe at any point that if Su Ping did stay in the store all the time, regardless of any situation, that he would have in any way been threatened, let alone his whole family been threatened by the world around him. As it would simply be too much on the world and not enough on him. Family heads would suddenly become so strong that voids, something they would literally flash inside cities and kill thousands immediately because of their bad breath, like the rat, would simply just no longer be issues for regular schmegler warriors. If the government was the one to actually get involved like this, we would essentially never have the issues of we would have the same solution. Everybody would just simply just be too strong to get through. Same thing with after the strike. If Su Ping simply stayed in the store, I don't think anybody, let alone the Ascensions or Celestials, would realistically have an issue with anybody in the Universe Dominator level, as everybody would simply just be okay with fighting at those higher levels. However, much like Su Ping, I don't know, and I can't really say for a fact of whether or not the Undying level and the Universe Dominator level could have been breached, as there was simply not enough to go by, even at Su Ping's level. So this gap in power would have eventually stopped. However, that is a large gap. The only thing I can really get behind this by is the mammoth, his chaos mammoth. Eventually, Su Ping gets his little chaos mammoth from the celestial, from his galaxy. That is significant enough to say that he can, or he should, go through the tournaments, at the very least. I think if Su Ping stayed in the store the entire time and never left, the story would eventually have a massive issue of power that it simply can't fight against. Not only the Ocean King, but also the Deep Cave King would essentially run into a brick wall, and everybody else behind them, such as their fate states and serpents, would essentially just turn tail and run. Even at the 9th rank, we do have quite a bit of an issue with power, even against normal people. There's just not much we can actually go by, as the heads would simply just take over from the family heads would take over everything, line the stores up with their own warriors, send the people and the battle pats. There's not much else to do. Just wait for them to get into oceans, and we would essentially be able to hit ocean stage battle pat warriors, and then they would dominate everybody else, with the only exception being stars. The only good reason for Supine to go out into the special cracks is obviously for the 10 billion federal coins. There's not really a good way for him to get it outside of that. As marketing and being a teacher at the academy ultimately did not help all that much, but it was hard for anybody to go against such ideas, as the family heads would simply be the better choice. And the people themselves would simply not be affected if they actually went through the same training. As the store states, everything in the universe can be a pet. Even a rock, or an eraser, or even a pig. Kind of like that one girl's pig. It just started to smell nice, but it was still very resistant. It would be even better if the sister of Suping did, in fact, use the 7 days from the tournament to train, as there was no reason to celebrate, as there was no victory. No real victory, at least. And ultimately, that's what all it boils down to. The might of the Astral Pets is all that matters. And if Suping just went by this ideology the entire way, he would not have lost as much as he would have had he not. There is also a discussion to suggest whether or how far everybody could have gone if everybody did know about this. But like I said, even in the Long John Beast Strike, there was ultimately thousands of people with those kinds of pets, but not necessarily coordinated like the families. So it's having the right tools, but the wrong person that uses it. Ultimately, answer to this question, yes. He could have minimized what happened had he been given the right amount of time for the right amount of people. I do think that the beast's landing on the continent from the island-sized Beast King would essentially be murdered at the very end of it. It would have been dealt with. Obviously, I think the special cracks that the Beast Kings made would have still been an issue, but it would have been a lot less on Suping to deal with and more on everybody else, as everybody just simply became stronger. And that's the vid.